Good afternoon. Welcome to Law is Stranger Than Fiction. I'm one of the co-hosts, Barry Scholl.
I'm your other co-host, Steven Bergman. We are both shareholders in the law firm of Richards Brandt Miller Nelson in Salt Lake City, Utah.
And today's segment has to do with why a hedge fund needed its own navy.
It's actually a fairly fascinating story that is entertaining for all except for perhaps people in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Anyway, back in 2001, Argentina was having some financial difficulties and defaulted on a substantial amount of debt, approximately $100 billion. It worked out restructuring with the majority of its bondholders, but several of them refused to restructure and eventually sold their bonds as distressed debt to several hedge funds.
And what did the hedge funds do?
Well, those hedge funds filed a lawsuit in federal court in New York, and much to the surprise of many, prevailed and obtained a judgment against Argentina for approximately $2 billion. And the way they prevailed, the bonds in question had what's referred to as a pari passu clause, which means that you have to treat those particular bondholders the same way you treat all your other bondholders. And the court ruled that by restructuring the debt with the other bondholders and paying the restructured debt, they had violated that clause by not making any payments to the bondholders who refused to restructure their debt.
And what kind of debt did this involve?
This was, you read about it in the papers. Banks will lend money to foreign governments to finance international transactions, trade, things like that. And then that money is used for economic programs, whatever it might be. But what got interesting here is after these hedge funds obtained a judgment against the country of Argentina, they then tried to enforce that judgment against the country of Argentina. Notwithstanding Argentina claiming, quite rightly, that as a foreign sovereign, it was immune to most judgment enforcement provisions. The first thing the hedge funds did is they served what's known as judgment enforcement discovery on Argentina. Argentina resisted that judgment enforcement discovery and, much to its surprise, lost, with the case going all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that, notwithstanding the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, judgment debtor discovery had to be answered, which meant that Argentina had to answer questions like what banks did it store its money in overseas, what transactions was it involved in, things like that.
I also understand that this involved, this also involved planes and boats as well.
This one particular hedge fund became very aggressive and creative in seeking to enforce its judgment. In one instance, it learned that the Argentinian presidential plane was coming to the United States for maintenance and made arrangements to seize that plane upon landing. The plane ended up being diverted because of that. In another instance, they learned that the country of Argentina was sponsoring a booth at an international booksellers fair in Germany, and the Argentinian government went to the length of having the particular booth in the name of a private citizen rather than the country. But where things got really absurd is when a Argentinian naval ship was doing a tour of West Africa, stopping in ports along the coast. And this particular hedge fund saw the route, learned the itinerary, and domesticated their judgment in the country of Ghana, and obtained an order from the High Court of Ghana to seize the ship when it came into port in Ghana.
Now, was this a warship?
It was a naval ship. It was used primarily for training purposes, but it was part of the Argentinian Navy. And when it stopped in this port in Ghana to refuel and get supplies, the government of Ghana, enforcing this order that the High Court had issued, seized the ship.
And what became of the crew?
Well, most of the crew went home. A few of the crew stayed on the ship to maintain the ship while it was in captivity or seizure or whatever you want to call it. And then Argentina filed a claim with the International Tribunal for the Law of the Seas that the seizure order was illegal in violation of international maritime law. After a couple of months, the tribunal issued a ruling that, in fact, the seizure order was illegal and ordered Ghana to release the ship.
What did Ghana do?
Well, after initially responding with, we'll think about it, Ghana did, in fact, let the ship go, and it sailed out to sea about 2 months after it had been seized in the port in Ghana. But the case doesn't end there, because making sure that this story continues on, Argentina then filed an international arbitration claim against Ghana for seizing the ship.
And how did the arbitrator rule?
Well, that one, the arbitrator never actually ruled. The parties ended up settling because apparently concurrent with this arbitration proceeding, there were proceedings in the Supreme Court of Ghana, and the Supreme Court ruled that, in fact, the seizure order was illegal. And so Argentina agreed to settle the arbitration on the provision that the country of Ghana published this decision internationally, essentially a public apology.
And Ghana publicly apologized.
They did. They posted the Supreme Court's order on various public websites from the country of Ghana. I think they also posted it with the United Nations and whatever other locations one has to post for to make an international apology. So, and so that was the end of the tale. The one thing that never was explained, the question you asked at the beginning, why exactly did the hedge fund need its own navy? But perhaps that's for another time. Presumably, you're not an international sovereign that is dealing with somebody trying to seize your military assets. But judgment enforcement and trying to enforce a judgment happens all the time. The attorneys at Richards Brandt Miller Nelson have a wealth of experience in dealing with judgment enforcement, both for judgment debtors and for judgment creditors. If you find yourself in a judgment enforcement situation, please contact an attorney at Richards Brandt Miller Nelson. And until next time, this is Law is Stranger Than Fiction.